guys, welcome back to Keeping It 99, the most edifying podcast in the world. And I'm joined here today with Jerome Ibrahim. Thank you, Jerome, for coming onto the podcast.
Absolutely.
Just one thing before we keep going, just lift the mic up. Like
Okay.
we gotta really be loud.
Okay.
Into it,
Gotcha.
So today we're talking about growing up in the Coptic Church. Obviously, we both grew up in the Coptic Church.
Yeah.
But everyone's experience is different. So today we're going to talk about your experience, including your immigration, moving here. So my first question for you is, what were some things growing up about the Coptic Church and the Coptic tradition that kind of stuck with you in your other aspects of life?
Yeah. So I grew up in Egypt. I moved here to the U.S. when I was 13. So I think it's a big difference, like in experience-wise, what you get growing up in the Coptic Church in Egypt and here. One of the biggest differences that I've noticed and I've kind of felt, like when I was there and then moved, was everything was centered around the Coptic Church. When we were in Egypt, for example, I would spend days on end that everything that I'm doing throughout my day was in the church, that I would not leave from 7 in the morning till midnight or 1 in the morning. Even at some point my grandma used to call her house the hotel that I just sleep at, because I've spent so many times throughout the day that I'm in the church, that I don't even come back home, everything. So it was let's say attend liturgy, and that was not just centered around Sundays. Here at the Coptic Church we kind of get it we go to church on Sunday and that's about it. Maybe some of us, if you're a really good deacon or someone church, you go to Saturday night for vespers and tisbeha. But that's about it for us. Church is kind of weekend thing that we do. But that was not the case in Egypt when we were growing up, throughout winter and summer. Of course, the summer you're in the church a lot more, playing games, in the Nadi with your friends and stuff like that. But even throughout the winter itself, we would be in the church, attending liturgy, doing services, or even just hanging out with friends. It would be in the church itself. Church doors were open 24/7, and we would just be always there, in the church. My mom didn't have to ask me where I'm at, because she knows if I'm not home, I'm at the church.
Yeah, and I will say, I've been to Egypt a couple times, and that's been one of the striking differences that I've noticed between the two as well. And I think that kind of goes from more of a broader culture perspective. You look here in America, not just in the church, but in everything you do, it's always about moving, always about doing the next thing. You go from one thing to another. And I think people feel the same way when it comes to church. So what are some ways that you feel in your life, now that you've moved to America, that you've kind of incorporated that same feeling of always being around the church into your daily life?
Yeah, I think it's like you said, when we're here in the U.S., it's always we're trying to pack as much as we can into our daily schedule, and I'm one to do that. My schedule is always hectic, and it's always okay, I'm gonna do this from 9 to 10, from 10:05 to 11, I'm doing that, and I try to pack it as much as I can, and there's no time for us to just rest or chill or do something that could incorporate the church in that. So I think what I've been trying to do, so I personally, the church that is back in my hometown is a little bit smaller. We do have a lot of activities going on throughout the week, but it's still a smaller church, and I'm used to the big church vibes in a way. Coming from Egypt, when church would have thousands of families, there's always something going on, and that's what kind of made me when I moved to college, I was kind of glad to be closer to the church here in Raleigh that we're at right now, because it's as close as it can get to how I felt being in the church in Egypt. There's always it's not just the Sunday, there's always services going on afterwards, either it's choir or whatever, helping out with something, or just being again at the church, just hanging out. I think that's as close as I get, and that's the feeling that I've been trying to kind of get back into my life, of having that same, not necessarily daily schedule, but have same routines of when being at the church. I want to, it's not just being in the church itself, praying in the services, liturgy, vespers, whatever, but just being in the church as a community and having that as being one whole, one family in a way.
And how would you bring that to a smaller church?
I think for that, it needs the servants itself. If you have active servants, you could have that same feeling in a smaller church. If you have Wednesdays you have hymns class, Thursdays you have Bible study, Fridays. So if you put something throughout each day in the church, and get it into, because a lot of excuses that we hear is like, oh, we don't have time to drive to the church. Like in Egypt, like I will give it them that. Like in Egypt, the churches were a lot closer. It was like a 5 minute walk from the house. Like within my home in Egypt, I had about 5 churches within a 10 minute walking distance max. But you don't find that here. Here, the closest one, like if you live relatively close to the church, you're a 5 minute drive. So a lot of the excuses that we hear is, oh, I don't want to bring my kids to the church. I don't have time for that. I'm tired. I just got home from work. I'm not like, I just got home at 5 p.m. I don't want to drive to the church at 6 p.m. for whatever service, 6 p.m. for like hymns class or whatever activity they want to do. So I think it goes down to the mentality of kind of like having the servants, first of all, to incorporate these services into the small church. And one thing that you notice, it's the same servants that are doing the same, like different activities. Like the ones that manage hymns class are the same ones that manage the scout, because there's not much servants, and the ones that are willing to do it, they either go all out or they do nothing. So the ones that go all out, you'll see them like they will be head of like 2 or 3 services that are going on in the church, and that's a beautiful thing to see. But it's getting the parents like to drive their kids for them to be be raised in that community of being always inside the church and having like that feeling that the church is not just the place for like, oh, I gotta wake up at 7 in the morning to a liturgy on Sunday, but it's more of like, that's my second home, where wherever I'm feeling down, I could go there.
Yeah, and I think like to gain that feeling about like what you just said about having the church as a second home, it comes from the community, it comes from the people around you.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of times, like, it's not just the big community, but it's the community that you surround yourself with, like within the church, when you have like your group of friends that you're always hanging out with that are at church. And so how would you encourage other youth who maybe don't have as many youth in their church, like you don't have as many groups really to pick from? What do you kind of tell them as sort of encouragement to kind of push them to create those friendships and to create that community that will keep them in the church for a long time?
I think that kind of goes back to like the friend groups themselves. Like personally, like our church is kind of just one big friend group, because again, there's not that like, it's all like our friend group is like 15 people that's like in the church back home, because that's like the high schoolers, maybe a couple of the middle schoolers, and the college people that go back and forth between their college and the hometown church. So I think that kind of goes back to like that friend group, that when they see someone on the outside that is not necessarily fitting in, bringing them in, that just one small step could do a lot for them in like either their spiritual life or just being closer to the church and considering it a second home, because it's like you said, they see the community, they see the friends, they have people there that they can talk to, have fun with, hang out with, and all that. So and then like, so when you're in a small church, it's that like going to bring that one person out into the church with you. And if you have someone that just moved to your hometown, it's like making that first step and first move to like, oh, hey, we're going to like Starbucks afterwards. Come with us. Like we're getting lunch for that restaurant. Come eat with us. And just these small steps would feel included and appreciated, that they can consider that as their community.
Yeah, and like to go along with what you said, I think as well, the social aspect and the spiritual aspect go hand in hand, I feel like, within a church community. But what I think a lot of times what happens is that they almost get mixed together. So how do you, as an individual, allow for that social and spiritual aspect to coexist without mingling the two, and still having your own personal spiritual life, and not just a spiritual life that's around others or in group settings?
Yeah, I don't see it necessarily as a bad thing, as long as you know where to draw the line in a way. Like, yeah, the church is a hangout place and a fun place, but there's also like the sanctuary portion of the church. Like when you're during liturgy, during Vespers, like when you go there, like you have to know what motivates you to go to the church, and kind of like like you're driving to the church right now. Why am I going? If I'm going to liturgy, am I going to the liturgy to hang out and see my friends afterwards, or am I going to liturgy because I want to feel connected to God and I want to have communion? So I think that would be like the biggest part in kind of like putting that mindset and like have that question always up, like as the first thing we think of, like why we're going to the church right now. Like right now I'm going to church, why am I going? Because if you're going to like liturgy and have communion or pray Vespers Tasbihah, that should not be at the same time as like, oh, I'm going to Vespers, but then during Tasbih or during Abu Nazwaz or during Bible study, whatever it is, I'm gonna be outside in the with my friends, like just playing like basketball or soccer, or whatever, because then you're not going for God, you're going to see your friends. And there's nothing wrong with going to see your friends, but that has to be its own thing. Like, oh, after Sunday school, I'm staying late till like 4 or 5 p.m. in the church to hang out with my friends, and that's okay because, again, the church is the community. So staying late and like hang out with your friends, that's okay, but to have like that line drawn between like, oh, right now that's like liturgy and service time, like I have like that's the time where it's my spiritual connectedness to God, and I gotta like just see like if I want to meet with my father of confession, all that, and then the other one is like where I'm hanging out with friends and I want to have fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it absolutely correctly that there has to be a line. There has to be like just in everything in life. There's a time for everything, and I think a lot of times, especially in larger church communities, the time for everything kind of gets mixed up together, and people do things they're not supposed to. People, kind of they kind of like bend the rules a little bit. They go into the gray area a little bit. Actually, remember I was actually here in December.
Oh, really?
I came for another reason completely, but I came to attend Kiach Praises one night, and I remember like walking in and realizing, from a complete outside view, because I don't go here obviously, realizing there's so many kids outside, I thought like, oh, maybe that hasn't started yet. That was the first thought that came to mind. And so obviously like that's one thing, is that trying to encourage people to come to church, but it's not like what you said, to come to church for the right reasons, to come to church in order to get that spiritual edification.
Yeah, like that's one thing that honestly like saddens me at some points, because our church is so beautiful and it's like rites and hymns and it's all like very carefully and meticulously like put together that it kind of fits in as a puzzle all together. Like Vespers and Tasbih, they're part of the liturgy. Like that's just the like with like at monasteries, for example, they start at Tasbih at 4 a.m. and they have Tasbih and then matins and then liturgy. It's all, but like it's not divided up like Saturday night and Sunday night. So when you say like that, you can see like saw kids outside, and I'm like, that's you, because at some point you don't know who to blame for that.
Yeah.
Because like growing up in the church, there has to be somewhere that someone plants the seed of the love for the church itself and its services. And that's like whether the Sunday school teacher or the parent or just someone out of curiosity wanting to be in the church, because some people like they don't even need that seed planted for them. It's already there from like just because they grew up in the church. And I think that's like one of the biggest differences. If the parents are involved in the church a lot and they come to the church, so the kid is kind of forced to be there at a young age, like from that like age like 4 to like 10, 12. If at that point they're kind of like forced to be in the church because that's just how their parents' schedule is at, that will keep growing with them from like past that 12-year-old age. Like when they start getting to middle school and high school, and they have the ability like to make their own decision, like, oh, I can drive to church right now, or I can go hang out of my friend's house. If that seed is planted to go to like, and that love for the church from a young age, I think they will continue to go to the church, because at that point they know the difference between that's not a hangout time, that's church time, because there's this baha going on right now. Let's go, like, and even encourage their friends to come with them, and not necessarily like to joke around and play around in the church. No, but to go, hey guys, let's go pray tasbih together. Like there is like the tasbih is going on, let's go like pray together right now.
So what would you say to kids who their parents weren't necessarily very invested in the church at a young age? Like, what do you say to them? Because at the end of the day, you don't want to give someone an excuse for their behavior of not going, or when they come to not, fully be attentive. So what do you say to them, to those kids who maybe their parents weren't super involved in church throughout their upbringing?
Yeah, I think it goes like at one point in life, it can like they can take matters into their own hands per se. Like if they're high schoolers, like sophomore, like driving age in North Carolina is like 16, with like you can drive by your own. So if you're like 16-year-old and like you haven't necessarily been involved in the church as much, you can come to the church, and they're like, I'm sure like you will find your friend groups that kind of involve you in everything, and you can talk to the priest and see what you can do, what you can get involved in, what services are available at what times. Because if you do like kind of not know what's going on in a way, you just know, oh, the church has a Sunday liturgy, but I don't know what other services they like do or provide. So you can like kind of take a step into your own right way of salvation per se, because if you come closer to the church, that will help you come closer to God. And just ask around, be like, hey, I'm like free on Tuesday night, do you guys have anything that's going on? Like, do you like have Bible study, do you have something that goes on that day? And then you will find something that's like, oh, we have that, let's go, we'll have like fellowship, and then we'll go out, we go to that restaurant that we can eat together. So yeah, I think like at one point you can take stuff in your own hands, that you come to a realization, you're mature enough that you're like, oh, I gotta be involved in that world. Because I love the Pope Shenouda saying of that we're not of that world because like we're different. And it's not that we're trying to fit in, because we cannot fit in because we're not from here. So it's like kind of like seeing where people are like you, and they have like shared mindsets and shared like basis of morals, pretty much, that you can, oh, you can be with these people because these are the people that are like you.
So what do you say to people who have like they have church friends, they have school friends? I think a lot of times in high school, kids they're in between the two and they don't know which to pick, which group to pick, who to hang out with. What's the advice you give to them to make a decision that's more edifying for them?
I think we all battle with that, like double-faced communities of what, like, where we belong. Like we have our like kind of mask and face that we show to our church friends, and then we have our mask and face that we show to our American friends. And I think I personally struggled with that growing up, and I would always talk to my father of confession. I'm like, Abuna, I can't, like, I don't know, I don't want to seem too religious with my like American friends. Like, oh, I'm going to church on a Wednesday night. Like why are you going to church on Wednesday night? Because some of the like most of like them are like not even that are involved in any church at all, or if they are, like the religious ones that like are involved in a church, they go on Sundays from their service like from 9 to 11, and that's about it. That's their only thing about church, that they go and praise, they hear the sermon from the pastor of their church, and that's it. So it's like I always had that face on, like I don't want to seem like, oh, that dude is like too religious, he's just weird or something like that. And then with my church friends, and I'm like, I can't be the same way that I am with my American friends, because then it's like, oh, you don't fit in here. So it's always like a battle of like inside of like trying to fit in with both groups. And the advice that I've always gotten, and I can't say that I've like necessarily been able to kind of work it into my life yet, but that it's always, it's like, oh, you will like find the friends that will help you in the right way. Like it's not necessarily that you have to cut off everyone else that's not from the church, but it's like see which people guide you in the right direction that would help to your salvation and that would help you become a better person.
I think it goes down to priorities of, obviously it's hard to realize in the moment, but it's, you're talking about your salvation, you're talking about eternity. And it's about pushing for that eternity. And there's a quote, I don't know who said it, but there's a quote that eternity is forever, but you pick it in every single moment of your life.
Yeah.
And each and every single decision you make, every single thing that comes out of your mouth, you're picking eternity or death. That's what you're picking at every single moment. And it's obviously a very like intimidating thing to think about. And I think especially for people who are going through what I would call like an identity crisis, to kind of figure out who they are in this world, for you to tell them you're either picking life or you're picking death at every single moment. So what is some sort of encouragement, or what are some words you say to those people? Because, you know, it's obviously a very daunting thing to think about.
I don't know if I have words of encouragement necessarily, but like it's the concept of eternity is kind of hard to grasp when we're like living in this age, or just like that we're like still in the world. Because like even most people kind of have like hard grasp like commitments in marriage, for example, because it's like, oh, you marry this person, that's who you're gonna live with for the rest of your life, and it's like, oh wait, that's a long time. So like the way when I always think about eternity, I'm like, okay, so I'm on earth right now. When I die, I'll either go like to heaven or hell, and I'm like, okay, but what after? Because our mind is always used to like, okay, but what after? But there's no after. So, and that's kind of thing that's like, and even when I tell that to myself, I still don't grasp it. That like, oh, there's like eternity, khalas, there's nothing else afterwards. That's where you are. That's where you'll spend eternity. So I think like it is people use some people use that as kind of like a punishment in a way. That's like, oh, that's like that, of course that's the ultimate goal, but why do you want to go to eternity, like go to heaven? Like, do you want to like spend the time with God because that's what you've been taught in the church since you were young? Is like, oh, heaven is good, hell is bad, cussing is bad, but eating communion is good, confession is good, but is like, is it just the only because that's what you've been taught since you're young, or is that's what your heart actually truly desire, to live in eternity in heaven with God? Because I think one thing we all, like, just a couple weeks ago during the Apocalypse night where we read the Revelation, it talks so much about what goes on in like the afterlife, and it is very hard to interpret it, and I personally do not understand it, but some things always like stick out to me, that like, and we say it in multiple areas of the liturgy, that it's like the cherubim and the seraphim are always praising continuously when they're up there with God. Like, it's always like just there's constant praising of God and happiness and joy. And I think just thinking of that, like when we feel just that shortness, like momentarily joy, we're happy. We're like, oh, it can't get better than that. But it can, because you can be happy for eternity, to have that joy in your life, and you live there for eternity. So I think you kind of be used almost as a life goal. That's the end of the line. That's where you want to reach. So you could use like going to hell as like kind of the opposite, and use that as like the punishment that awaits you if you don't do that, or if you go against like the will of God or the commandments and all that. But you could like use that as the punishment, or use looking over the goal to the joyful eternity as kind of like, oh, that's what I want to be, so that's why I'm gonna pursue a good life.
Yeah, what comes to mind when you say that is perfect love casts out all fear. And I think how that kind of relates is that the fear of hell, or the fear of, ending up in a burning fire forever, is like, that's the start. That's the starting point. The starting point is the elementary level, the kindergarten level is hell is bad.
Yeah.
And then it graduates into, no, I love my Creator. He wove me together. He perfectly and wonderfully made me, like it says in Psalm 119, I think it is. And it goes into that level, and then it goes into, no, like I want to give my entire being to God.
Yeah.
The perfect love, the like what Christ says, there's no greater love than to lay down one's life for his friends. So I think that's kind of the progression, and I think that relates back to what we were talking about earlier about like going to church for what reasons. It starts out as, I go to church because my friends are there. Yeah. And then it graduates into, no, I go to church because I love the actual service. And then it finally graduates to, no, I love church, like going to church, going to services, because I want to spend time with my Creator. I want to spend time with God. And so I think it's the same thing. It's the same idea, is that, like, sure, hell is bad, but why is that our focus? At the end of the day, you have to focus, you have to fixate your eyes on Christ. You have to focus on the right path. And so that leads me to my next question, which is, in this world that is full of all of these things, of suffering and all these things, how do you fixate on Christ on a daily basis?
It always amazes me about like the people we hear about that like have this immediate connection with God as a friend and one-to-one. In a way, like, we've heard a lot of stories about either priests or monks or bishops that have that connection with God, that they can just talk to him and that he listens. It's like me and you are talking right now. Like, that's how they talk to God. And reaching that level of spirituality is like always amazes me. I'm like, how can one possibly like reach that level? And it's not necessarily like to like, oh, I want to reach that level, but of course it should be the goal that you like take God as a friend and have him like have that kind of connection with him, because at the end of the day he is like, you're his son. He made you. And so like, and it makes me wonder, it's like, what kind of church did they grow up to? Like, how did they have their friends in the church, their family? Like, what was the reason that, like, who planted that seed for you to turn out that way? We always hear about like, and current monks that are living, like, I go to spend at least a week or two in the monastery every year, this down in Texas, and the like monks and the stories they tell, it always just like mind blowing in a way, and not necessarily about their personal experience, which I'm sure they do, but not everyone goes out to say, oh, like I have that personal experience with God, but they always talk about others. And they have like that sense of humility, like, oh, I could never reach that, but sometimes, like when a monk passes away, like I've had a personal experience with a monk that I've known, that he always used to talk about like these saints and like these other like incarnate monks that like live in the desert and stuff, and that they have their that personal connection with God, but he would always kind of say, but like I am nothing compared to them. But when he passed away, we found out that he was like he had that connection even more sometimes than the stories that he used to tell us. So, and it kind of takes me back to like growing up in the church. Then I'm like, can someone ever reach that level of spirituality and connection with God? That's like, what made you that way? Like, what did that Sunday school teacher tell you to like have that love of God that you just want to dedicate your whole life for Him? You want to go to the monastery, and even that you want to progress even further to just like live alone and all that. So yeah, when it comes to that, so I'm like, I wonder what we're doing right in our life in a way, because we're nowhere near where these people are at in their life right now. And that's like, it's peaceful, it's joy. Like you never see a monk that's upset or like that's yelling or angry or anything, because like they have reached this like level in spirituality and like in their life that is just, it's all like nothing on earth matters to them, because they're already living in heaven with God. So yeah, like it's stuff like that I'm like, I want to know what you did growing up that I could try to be like you.
So how do you instill that seed into the people that you interact with, the Sunday school kids, or just anyone in general that you interact with on a day-to-day basis? How do you instill that seed that was instilled in those great people?
I think I always think about the quote. I remember in Arabic, I can't translate it in English specifically, but I say like kind of what it means afterwards. But it's like, انظروا إلى نهاية سيرتهم فتمثلوا بإيمانهم, which is like, look towards like the end of like how their life ended, so you could be like them. And that kind of always like, it takes me back like, okay, it's like the Synaxarion. Let's read like their like how that specific saint lived. Like look at Saint Moses the Strong. He lived his whole life in sin, and like he did everything that you could possibly imagine. He murdered, he was an adulteress, he was a thief, he was a criminal. Everything that we see people right now that we don't even want to touch with a 6-foot pole right now, he has done that and he transformed. So there is nothing that like you can think, because a lot of people think like, oh, I'm not into that church life, like I'm too sinful for that, God wouldn't want me. A lot of people think that way, that it's like, no, I can't take communion, like I'm a sinner. I read it recently, like a couple days ago, a story about Bunab Shoy Camel. He was during resurrection feast one time, and it was in when they were doing the procession after reenactment, and Abu Nabshoy Camel was like, he was giving incense to the icon while going around, and he sees a guy that's just sitting at the end of the church, like kind of has his hands on his face, and he's like upset. And what Abu Nabshoy Camel does at that moment in time, he gives the Shoria to Abuna Loa Sardrios, and he runs to that guy. He in the middle of the church, he runs to him, and he's like, Habibi, do you want to go talk outside? Let's go talk. And that's in the middle of procession. Like that is in the middle of like the biggest part of the resurrection liturgy, the Eid. And he goes and tells him like, hey, what's wrong? Why you look outside? He was like, Abuna, I am so far away from God. Like I don't even know why I came here today. Like I was just I was passing by the church, and I saw the lights in the church, so I said I would go in. So I don't even know why I am in here today. So Allah, it's okay, no problem. Let's take communion together today, and we'll talk afterwards. Allah, no, Abuna, I am sinful. I cannot take communion. God doesn't love me. So it's like, how can someone reach that mindset in a way that, no, God doesn't want me to take communion? Because that is not true. Because at the end of the day, we're all his kids, and he would rejoice with one sheep that returns than instead of the 99 that he already has in the church. So it's like reading either the same stories or knowing about how like these people lived that we were talking about, because it shows like we can talk all day about all things that they did, but actually applying these things in our lives, that's what's going to make a difference. Because we read about these great people and priests like Abuna Shoikim, Abuna Sadros, like all these great servants that have done great things for the church, and their name is everywhere. You would go to any Coptic person, tell him like Abuna Shoikim, they're like, oh, of course I know who he is. I've heard his stories, I've heard about Shoikim, but you've heard his stories, great, but how can you incorporate what he did into your life to become a better person and to make that get you closer to God?
And that's the hardest thing to do. The hardest thing
It
to
absolutely
do
is. It is not easy. If it was like in the gospel, it said it is easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than it is
easier for a camel.
for a camel through to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go into heaven. And that's not necessarily about the money. It's not talking like it's talking about the money in that verse, but that does not necessarily what it means.
Yeah.
So if it was easy, everyone would have done it, but it's not. And again, that's the reward that we look forward to, that we live the righteous and life that is we're close to God, and we're getting that reward at the end.
So what is some encouragement, some last words you would give for people who are looking to push for that reward?
I would say go to the church. It's a very simple thing to do, but one thing will drag another, and you will feel closer to God when you're there. Because when you're in the physical building, because you're like, the monks have a saying of where your alaya is where your heart is. Like, it's not the physical space that you just have in the monastery that you pray in, but no, everywhere is your alaya. And why they say that? Because they're constantly praying, constantly thinking of God. Even if they're talking like to people right now, or they're talking amongst each other, they're still in their head. There's always a prayer that is going on. It's like, and whatever that prayer is. So being in the physical space, that's kind of the first step to take. So being physically in the church, being like with friends, okay, like we still live in the world. No one say like to cut off all ties and go to the desert and be with God 24/7, and that would be a wonderful thing to do. But at the level that we're at right now, like, just go to the church, hang out with friends, but like go to the liturgy, go to the tasbih, feel like not. It's amazing like how our liturgical words, if you actually like try to read them slowly and kind of dive deep into them, just to like go into like say like the simplest thing that we always say, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. We always recite it. I would dare you to find one person that like is saying it at the end after communion, and that is actually praying our Father, that is like praying to God, and that's the prayer that they're using. Everyone at the end, like when we're saying it, we're just reciting a thing that they made us memorize in first grade. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. What does it mean? If you dive deep into our liturgical words, you will like find all the answers that you could ever possibly want in it. Like everything. And if you just take two words, we could spend hours upon hours talking about just our Father, or talking about the Kanuni Iman, or talking about anything that's in or that reconciliation prayer, anything that's in the church. We can spend hours talking about it, just taking each word or two words, diving deep, like, why did the church forefathers put that together, and why did they put that word necessarily to describe that? And so I think it's just being in the church and actually praying, even if it's just not, because not everyone is good with prayers that just just praying to God one-on-one, and that will come at some point. You will have that connection with God, that you're just talking on him one-to-one, and you're telling him how you feel, telling him what you need, telling him. And that's not just necessarily asking for physical and like materialistic things, but just having that one-on-one conversation with God. But if you just use the Agbeya, use the Psalms, use all that, because that has everything that you might possibly need to grow that connection with God and start it there.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Jerome, for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys for watching. Make sure
Thank
to
you,
like,
guys.
comment, subscribe, turn on post notifications. See you guys next week. Thank you. Thank you.